Buenas tardes a todos, muy bienvenidos. Soy Manuel Torres, soy catedrático de Ciencia Política de la Universidad Pablo de Olavide y bueno, pues soy el responsable o la persona de enlace con esta actividad que vamos a tener hoy y que es una iniciativa de esglobal y de la Embajada de Estados Unidos de América en España. La verdad que es un placer volver a albergar, aunque sea virtualmente, en el ámbito de la Universidad Pablo de Olavide esta actividad. Ya hemos participado en los 2 años anteriores y es una fortuna porque creo que es una excelente oportunidad para que nuestros estudiantes pues, puedan seguir formándose y participar en debates que suelen ir bastante más allá de lo que tenemos oportunidad de tratar en las distintas asignaturas, incluso las de carácter especializado. Mi Defensa y Yo, la verdad que es una iniciativa que a mí particularmente me gusta y que por eso siempre que hemos tenido la posibilidad de integrarla en la actividad formativa de la universidad, pues no hemos dudado y con ese propósito, ¿no? de que nuestros estudiantes tengan la posibilidad de participar en una iniciativa que se oferta a nivel nacional en múltiples universidades y que tengan la posibilidad de participar en ese selecto grupo de estudiantes que tendrán la ocasión de realizar un viaje de estudios a Bruselas y conocer desde el interior organizaciones tan fundamentales para la estructura de seguridad como es la OTAN. Yo, sin más, le paso la palabra a Cristina Manzano, que es la directora de Global, y reiterando el agradecimiento tanto a ella como a la embajada por sumarnos otro año más. Y nada más. Hola, Cristina.
Hola Manuel, muchísimas gracias por tus palabras, por la acogida, también por colaborar un año más, como estabas comentando, con esta iniciativa, y bienvenidos, bienvenidas a todos los que estáis al otro lado de la pantalla. Yo solamente quiero enmarcar el programa, contaros un poco más. Como estábamos comentando, esta es la 3ª edición. El objetivo de este programa, que se realiza gracias a la colaboración de la Embajada de Estados Unidos en España, es extender el conocimiento y la comprensión de los temas de seguridad y defensa entre vosotros, estudiantes universitarios de España. Porque aunque en concreto vosotros sí estáis estudiando cosas relacionadas con la seguridad y la defensa, suele ser una materia muy alejada de la realidad, incluso en los estudios de relaciones internacionales. Y si esto ha sido siempre importante, pues en estos momentos todos somos conscientes de que muchísimo más. Así que de nuevo, gracias a la Embajada por hacer posible este programa, y gracias a Manuel Torres y a la Universidad Pablo de Olavide por colaborar. Como sabéis, el programa tiene 2 patas, una que es esta actividad que vamos a tener hoy. La ponente Evanna Hu se conectará en unos momentos, y la otra pata es el concurso, y os animo desde luego a que participéis, porque por universidad hay un premio. El premio, como comentaba Manuel, es ese viaje a conocer la sede de la OTAN y otras instituciones relacionadas con la seguridad y la defensa en Bruselas, pero sobre todo os ayuda el participar en este concurso a fijar estas ideas y a analizar estas ideas y estos temas de los que estamos tratando hoy. Yo también quiero, por supuesto, invitaros a que leáis esglobal, porque muchas de estas cuestiones las tocamos ahí continuamente con diferentes enfoques. Sobre la dinámica de lo que vamos a hacer hoy, pues en cuanto se conecte Evanna, ella os compartirá con vosotros sus conocimientos en el tema de la inteligencia artificial. Como siempre, no puede estar más de moda. Si era un tema que ya nos preocupaba y nos ocupaba con los avances del ChatGPT, es lo recurrente en las últimas semanas, y después daremos paso a vuestras preguntas. Os voy a pedir que las vayáis haciendo por el chat, y yo luego os voy dando la palabra. Esta actividad va a ser en inglés. Nosotros ahora estamos hablando en español porque no está la ponente estadounidense. Ella va a hablar en inglés, y vosotros, si alguno no se siente cómodo haciendo las preguntas en inglés, las podéis lanzar en español y yo las traduzco sin más. Pero bueno, lo interesante es que también quien vaya a Bruselas va a tener que hablar en inglés, o sea que es un buen momento también para practicar. Yo lo voy a dejar aquí. Manuel, si te parece, vamos enmarcando la cuestión, que tiene muchísimas vertientes. Estás en silencio, estás todavía en silencio.
Ahora, muchas gracias, Cristina. La verdad que es un tema que resulta fascinante y me alegro que este haya sido el objeto del seminario que se celebra hoy en la Universidad Pablo de Olavide, porque tiene la ventaja de que es un asunto absolutamente transversal, que afecta a múltiples dimensiones de la seguridad y de la defensa, y por lo tanto no es simplemente una mera cuestión técnica o que tenga interés desde la perspectiva de la innovación tecnológica, que la tiene, sino sobre todo por cómo las tecnologías al final afectan al comportamiento de los actores implicados en cualquier dinámica. Esta es una constante que, por ejemplo, vemos a lo largo de la historia, precisamente cómo las innovaciones van modificando el comportamiento y la estrategia de los países. Al final, la inercia a veces es interpretar muchos de estos avances técnicos como una herramienta más que está a disposición de quien la quiera emplear, pero la constatación es que al final este tipo de herramientas terminan desplegando una serie de cambios absolutamente profundos que van más allá de ampliar las capacidades de quien las emplean. Eso además en el ámbito de la seguridad nacional o de los conflictos armados pues es especialmente evidente. Pensemos, por ejemplo, que en ocasiones la Primera Guerra Mundial se ha definido como una guerra con estrategias del siglo XIX y armas del siglo XX. Y eso hizo que los participantes en ella pues, se viesen desbordados por todos esos cambios que se habían producido casi de manera instantánea y que no eran capaces de asimilar. Es decir, cómo todas esas estrategias basadas en la guerra de maniobra, en las batallas casi napoleónicas, pues quedaban totalmente anuladas pues, cuando aparecían en el campo de combate las ametralladoras, los tanques, los aviones, que eran armas inéditas hasta el momento. Yo creo que ese referente histórico nos sirve para que no despreciemos la importancia que tiene precisamente la inteligencia artificial a la hora de añadir esa capa de innovación en cosas que ya existen. De hecho, hace poco leía en una revista sobre tecnología, ¿no? Muy centrada en Silicon Valley, que precisamente todas las grandes empresas y las pequeñas también actualmente están volcadas en la inteligencia artificial, pero no tanto desde una perspectiva del desarrollo puro de esta herramienta, sino en utilizar ya los avances que son ya tangibles para añadir esa capa de inteligencia artificial, cosas que ya existen, desde lo más básico a lo más avanzado. Y precisamente como esa pequeña innovación sumada a cosas que ya están en nuestro día a día, pues sean los electrodomésticos, los vehículos, las búsquedas en Internet, etcétera, pues terminan dando lugar a herramientas completamente diferentes a las que estamos acostumbrados a emplear. Esto, llevado en el ámbito de la seguridad y en la posibilidad de que toda esa capa de mejora que da la inteligencia artificial pues, se emplee en sistemas armamentísticos, desde la aviación, los misiles, la inteligencia, las comunicaciones militares, da lugar a un escenario que es, por un lado, fascinante, pero por otro lado también preocupante, ¿no? Porque esto puede generar una expectativa en ocasiones de uso que no son realistas y pueden llevar a los actores a ser en ocasiones más agresivos o que asuman mucho más riesgo de los que acometerían en otro contexto. Y también está el problema de no saber digerir cuáles son las consecuencias de esas nuevas herramientas que tenemos a nuestra disposición, ¿no? Realmente hay siempre una capa de una curva de aprendizaje, ¿no? De toda tecnología, pero cuando estamos hablando de su empleo en algo tan sensible y al mismo tiempo tan problemático como los conflictos, pues cualquier sociedad debe ser muy, muy reacia a ese tipo de aventurismo, ¿no? Yo creo que este tipo de eventos, ¿no? y personas como Evanna, que se han dedicado a estudiar en profundidad esta cuestión, pues nos van a arrojar mucha luz a estos debates. Y como veo que ya acaba de entrar la protagonista del seminario, pues no voy a consumir más tiempo del que tenemos pensado y bueno, pues le doy la palabra de nuevo a Cristina para que la introduzca. Gracias a todos.
Perdonadme que estaba en silencio. Estamos conectando con Evanna, como habéis podido ver en su biografía. Ella es Senior Fellow en el Atlantic Council, que es un think tank en Estados Unidos, y es también CEO y socia de Omelas, que es una firma especializada en inteligencia artificial y que trabajan, entre otras cosas, en mapear la información, el ecosistema de la información en línea. Y ella tiene experiencia en seguir numerosísimas crisis en algunos casos y situaciones en otros en todo el mundo, con lo cual pues lo que estaba comentando Manuel encaja perfectamente con esa experiencia y con esa necesidad de conocer primero lo que está ocurriendo en el entorno de la información para después poder tomar decisiones. Y precisamente también, como estabas contando, ¿no? Hasta qué punto la capacidad de aprendizaje de las máquinas puede llegar a tener una autonomía propia que nos desborde como sociedades. Evanna, I cannot see you.
I'm here.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
great.
there you go. Perfect.
Thanks for being here. Just let me tell you your introduction. I introduce you visually to Manuel Torres Serrano, and we have a large bunch of students behind the screen. We have already set the framework for the discussion, so I'll just go and give you the floor. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. I am also going to share my screen right now. Can you give me access to share my screen, please?
On it. We are on it. Yeah, you should be able now. No sabemos qué ha pasado, pero está volviendo, está volviendo. Okay. Evanna, are you back?
Yes. So
Can you try and share your screen now?
okay, perfect. Now I can. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Let me just scroll this down. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about tech and national security with all of you. And we're first going to talk a little bit about sort of my personal journey through this very new field, especially because of the new, advancements in AI and a lot of these words, buzzwords that we're now using. And I'll go into a little bit more of the promises of technology, but also some of the things that we should watch out for in terms of the future of technology and national security. So up here, I started out, with TikTok. Obviously, it's a social media platform that a lot of you are currently on. But there's also a national security conversation around whether or not TikTok should be used not only on US government official phones, but also whether or not it should be banned completely in certain countries because of data privacy concerns, right? And then there is ChatGPT, which is probably the most well-known AI tool out there, along with Midjourney and DALL-E, et cetera. But here the conversation has not only been around, okay, what can a LLM, so a ChatGPT is essentially an LLM algorithm, and LLM stands for large language models. How can this be used in disinformation? And how can we actually use this for national security purposes in terms of training large data sets that go beyond just text? But of course, ChatGPT in everyday life can also be used to write your homework for you or to write your essay, even though there are some caveats in that as well. And then we also have Skynet. A lot of times when we talk about autonomous weapons, a question that we get the most is, is Skynet going to be the next thing? Are we going to be dominated by robots? And so I wanted to open up with these 3 examples to sort of show you the wide range of going somewhere from, social media, which is TikTok, all the way to autonomous weapons, and how we should think about these things in terms of ethics and transparency and data privacy. So why does this matter? And this matters because unfortunately, national security permeates multiple aspects of society about how we live and what we do every day, even though it might not be the most noticeable thing, right? Technology, especially AI, has made national security just even more prevalent in our lives. And so one of the things, and I kind of, experienced this when I was actually, before I was even born. Many of you already know about the Tiananmen Square massacre. And so both of my parents were professors in China at the time. My mom is an ethnic minority, but they were academia. And so after the Tiananmen Square massacre, where the Chinese government essentially violently, killed a lot of the protesters who wanted democracy and freedom of speech, etc. They essentially took all of the academia class in China and they put them in hard labor camp. And so my mom actually got pregnant with me in a hard labor camp, and that was where I was born. And so a lot of times when I have to write and complete, what hospital were you born in for government forms and things like that, I'm like, well, I don't really know. Like, it's not really a hospital. I was born in a hard labor camp. And so, and after that, we moved around significantly. I actually grew up in Italy, France, and the US. And so I was sort of this third culture kid, but multiple that by 3. As I said, my mom's an ethnic minority. And so we have the Chinese and the, Mongolian cultures within my family. But then, of course, because I went to school in the US and then also have that Italian and French roots, and my dad spent a lot of time in Germany, where, when we are speaking to each other, we're speaking in 5 different languages, and we're we're cultural context switching a lot, even in the same sentence. And so the way that, and then at the same time, when I was 11, I was really bored one day and taught myself how to code HTML, and ended up creating GeoCities websites, which definitely predates most of you that I'm speaking to right now. But essentially it was the 90s version of WordPress. And that's where I got really interested in tech. But, I didn't really marry the two together until much later. After college, I lived in Nairobi, Kenya, and saw the power of M-Pesa. And M-Pesa currently runs about 20% of the country's GDP. And M-Pesa is a very simple SMS platform where you can basically pay your bills, you can get a loan, and it was all done through SMS without access to the internet. And that really revolutionized Kenya, and the reason why Kenya, leapfrogged a lot of the other countries in this development, but also in the adoption of technology. Unfortunately, while I was there, the Westgate Mall attack happened. And so this was a series, before the attack, there was a series of attacks by Al-Shabaab along the coastal lines, and as well as against the Kenyan government, the military, etc. And al-Shabaab at the time was aligned with al-Qaeda, later switched allegiance to ISIS. But 9 of my friends were shot and killed in the attack. And I kind of thought, well, I want to do whatever I can to help people, because for months after that, we were all terrified to congregate in crowded places, which is understandable. But so, what's the point on working on education and which was what I was working on at the time, when people were too afraid to leave their homes to even go and get an education and go to schools. And I figured, because the government is quite slow, it's trying not to be as antiquated as other industries, but it is definitely the lagging indicator. And so how can I actually use my technology background to help the government improve its services? And that included national security. So fast forward, I'm not going to go through what I do at each places, but the reason why I want to bring this up is because, I created Omelas because I realized that we needed data. Because in order to actually prove that the government is effective in different aspects of influence operations and in the propaganda is putting out, we actually need to be able to measure it. And at the time, the only thing that the government was measuring in its digital campaigns on Facebook and on YouTube to prevent people from going abroad and joining ISIS was the click-through rate. And now both you and I know that we click on plenty of things that we don't ever read, right? But the only thing that the government was capturing was the number of clicks. So that was very ineffective. And so it's about, how do we actually bring in technologies from the private sector, especially from advertising? So think about how on Insta, you're getting ads from Nike, from whatever that you like, and how powerful those posts are. So that was what started me down the path of Omelas. And at the same time, I started bumping into this problem that, well, the US government and NATO, who I was working for at the time, at the same time, didn't really have a strategy, right? Didn't have a strategy on influence operations, because didn't really see the importance of non-kinetic warfare, including like cybersecurity, influence operations, etc., until really the Ukraine war. And despite the fact that the 2016 presidential election and many more elections around the world were impacted by, actors that should not have gotten involved in a national election. So how can we actually help the government come up with a strategy? And that's the reason why at the Atlantic Council brought me on. And then finally, when it comes to global implementation, so I joined them as a senior advisor for cybersecurity, because I wanted to help a nonprofit that essentially advances democracy in about 100-some different countries around the world, protect the digital identities and security of civil society works, activists, etc. If you think about the number of reporters that have gotten arrested or killed or assassinated in places like Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., how can we actually make sure that their digital footprints did not lead them to being arrested? And I really liked IRI's perspective on focus on the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, frankly, is sometimes a lot more important than just the Western powers, like US, Paris, London, Brussels, etc. So how can we also give them a voice and make sure that we avoid this sort of the white saviorist mentality that sometimes these headquarters have in Western capitals? And so throughout this entire process, right, tech has been really important, whether or not we're talking about data, what we're talking about the AI-driven analytics that we're currently developing and using. And so before I talk a little bit more about the possibilities and the potential of technology. Just want to talk a little bit more about, what is not. So tech does not change the intent and the motives, but it does certainly lower the cost and increases the feasibility of achieving certain objectives. Good example is that just because, we have social media, it does not mean that it changed the intent of the Russian government to, let's say, interfere in the 2016 election. But what it did do is that it drastically decreased the cost. So just to give you a number, Russia only spent $3 million per month on influence operations in the 2016 election. That number is significantly lower than what one weapon system will cost. One Bradley, one B-21 bomber, et cetera, right? But they did it, and they were able to prioritize influence operations because it is so cheap and because Russia doesn't really have the monetary resources. But it didn't really change their intent, right? Their intent was there all along. Tech also has a lot of the same human biases and the wrong assumptions. And in fact, a lot of the tech actually compounds them. Because at the end of the day, technology is created by engineers who are people. And unfortunately, a lot of these biases are cognitive biases. So they're not intentional, they're just inherent. And so if we don't have the guardrails to think about algorithms, et cetera, then these algorithms are only going to compound them. In the US, there has been a lot of conversation around whether or not police can use algorithms that unfairly or racially profiles Black people. And same thing with when you go out to a bank for a loan for a house in the US, because traditionally, Black people just haven't really been homeowners. And so this algorithm basically says, well, okay, so in the past, the majority of the homeowners are white and they're well-to-do. And so it basically makes it significantly harder for a Black person to get a loan, even if they do have the money and the credit history and the credit score. Everyone has a say in conversations around technology, especially when it comes to national security, from surveillance cameras to facial recognition, to even using like GPS and Google Maps to make sure that we don't actually drive into a ditch, right? In the very early versions of Google Maps, and by the way, GPS was created by DARPA, which is a part of the US Department of Defense. And then 15 years after its invention, they allowed the civilian world, us, to use it. And so the Google Maps actually came out of DoD through an acquisition of a company called Keyhole. And in the very early versions, it would literally say like, turn left, and you look to the left and there was a river. And you're like, well, I literally cannot turn left. And so there were a lot of mistakes. And the reason why Google Maps doesn't make those mistakes anymore, is because there were human intervention in terms of talking to Google or posting on the forum saying like, hey, I don't think you got this road right, or this road has changed. And then how do we actually make it better? And when it comes to something like facial recognition, it's the same thing, right? It's not just the policymakers and the people, the C-suite who actually run these technology companies who have a say. There have been plenty of petitions out there that have basically said, no, we actually do not want surveillance cameras in certain places because of data privacy concerns. And that was done at a very grassroots level, just from the average person like you and me. The fourth point is that data is not enough. Data must be underpinned with the right context. And so if you think about, sometimes numbers are just numbers, and the way that I interpret them is very different. A good example is if you look at media outlets around the world that are funded 100% by the government. There's almost no way that you can put RT, which is funded by the Russian government, at the same level as BBC, which is funded by the British government. But on paper, their ownership is 100% government owned. I was like, well, yeah, but a BBC reporter is going to have a lot more editorial freedom to write whatever they want, including, criticizing the UK government. Whereas if you're talking about RT, you know for a fact that there's a lot of agenda controlling by the Kremlin. So that context is really, really important, especially when we're living in a world that's increasingly more focused on how can I get the most data. And also, I don't know if there are any engineers in the room, but if any of you know how to code, the first thing that they teach you is garbage in, garbage out. So if you have garbage data in, you're going to get garbage data out. That's sort of like the mantra for machine learning engineers now. And then the final point is triple verification. Tech through things like deep fakes, shallow fakes, to your synthetic voice, etc. Now just require all of us to triple check our sources and do a lot more critical thinking when we're reading something like the news. Is it real? Is it misinformation? Is it propaganda? Is it just plainly fake? And that's something that the education system should also start integrating as well. Right. So accountability, and as I've touched on this point a lot throughout the presentation, but the lack of international standards and conventions around ethics and transparency has been a huge problem, especially when it comes to AI. So good example is when we were coming up with the ethics AI principles for the Department of Defense, we had to grapple with the question of, is the US government allowed to use autonomous weapons? And the reason we were having that conversation is because A, we know for a fact that there are other countries out there that are using it. B, can you actually be competitive and win a war if you ban the use of autonomous weapons? But more importantly, there's an argument that autonomous weapons can't think on its own. It can calculate or do calculations a lot faster than the human mind, and so it's a lot more accurate, which means that collateral damage like civilian casualty rate should actually go down with the use of an autonomous weapon. But here's the rub, right? If the algorithm is bad or something goes wrong with the machine, and this weapon accidentally kills 10 school children because it just assumed that they were bad guys, like, who is actually accountable for those deaths? Is it the weapon, or is it the person who built the weapon? Is it the person who's supposed to oversee the weapon? Or is it the company that made the weapon? And we don't have any good answers. Ultimately, the US government said we're not going to use autonomous weapons. But that's a conversation that we should all be having right now, which is it's kind of like nuclear weapons. Like, we're going to get to that point where it's going to be used, and then we're going to confront this question of accountability. And then even if, let's just say, a rogue state says, you know what, I'm going to use it, they kill a bunch of civilians, how are we actually going to sanction them, right? How are we actually going to enforce those norms? Is it through the UN? Is it through, some other international body? Like, we have to think about those things. And so being a part of that conversation, I actually think is quite interesting, because technology is only going to advance. And every single time there's an advancement, we have to go back and like, okay, let's go back to the ethics and the governance, and how do we actually control this thing? Another thing I just want to bring up is, the governance of the digital space and the metaverse. Now, a lot of people are thinking about lessons learned from social media platforms in terms of content moderation, and how do we actually put those guardrails in from the get-go in the metaverse before everyone starts to be on it. I think that's another really interesting conversation. There are a lot of actually careers that have like cropped up because of that. And you know, those careers certainly did not exist 5 years ago. Okay. So the future, I think technology in national security is really interesting because it's changing all the time. There are new jobs are being created. So I actually, for example, my company right now, we just hired our first prompt engineer, which is, you know, before the earlier version of ChatGPT was actually created about 2 years ago. Like a prompt engineer wasn't a thing, but now they're the hottest commodity in tech. And basically their job is to know how to enter prompts into AI models to get the most accurate thing that you want. And they're quite expensive. And then you don't really need to be technical in terms of coding, but you do need to understand the fundamental tech concepts. But being technical is definitely a plus. I would actually say that if like everyone at this point should be taking a computer science 101 class in order to really understand what's happening. And then there's the, you know, create versus apply new technology. So when it comes to deep tech, we always talk about the research and development, and then, so which is, you know, the creating new AI, but then there's also a lot of what we consider as application or basic research. And that's how can I take something that's already been created, but creatively apply it to solve another issue. If you look up combinatorial creativity, that's sort of, you know, it's not, you're not creating anything new per se technologically, you're just applying it in a new way. But more importantly, you just have to be able to like translate between tech speak into policy and layman speak. And this is where I frankly think our policymakers are really, really bad at, because a lot of them don't understand tech enough. You know, I think this was in 2019, right before COVID hit, but the US Senate called all the tech leaders, you know, the CEO of Facebook, the CEO of Twitter, et cetera, and they all brought them in for questioning about social media. And the questions that the senators were asking were just like totally laughable, because they didn't understand even the basics of how to use a social media platform. And they made a fool of themselves significantly more. And you could actually see that Mark Zuckerberg at times were trying really hard not to laugh because the questions were laughable, right? And so how do you actually, if you can go between those two camps of people, that is a significant amount of like power, essentially, and also your ability to impact change. And then finally, despite an increase in digital balkanization, tech is truly global and requires a global mindset. Tech doesn't really have any boundaries, right? It doesn't respect the transnational boundaries between Spain and Portugal, or France, or wherever. And so it's really thinking about, you know, how can this be used by all sorts of people? What are some of the pitfalls and what are some of the things that we should actually mitigate ahead of time as well? So I went through this slide pretty quickly. If you have any questions, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Evanna. It's extremely interesting. I'm sure there will be many questions, but let me first give the floor to Manuel, so
yes,
we may have some initial reaction.
Okay, hello. Congratulations, Evanna. I think it's a very stimulating debate. I have some thoughts about your speech, but in particular, for me, it's especially interested your proposal that the society have to take part in the debate about the ethical issues about the artificial intelligence development. No, but it's not easy to take part in this debate. No? I would like to hear your opinion about how students, like people that follow this seminar, can take part in this debate.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first thing is to educate yourself about what has already been out there. A lot of the debates so far have been at a very elite level in terms of like it is at a policy level, whereas at academic level, you'll find a lot of scientific papers out there about AI and bias, but I haven't seen a group that's very effective in saying, okay, we know all of these things, and we know that we have to think about it, but it hasn't been applied to everyday life. I think the closest I have seen is when employees at Google walked out because of Google's involvement with a national security project. And Google also unfairly fired a few of their very prominent AI scientists for bringing up the fact that Google technology has been used or could have the potential of being used for bad, and that Google, the company, just did not they didn't listen to them internally. So I think that activism is still really lacking. There are a couple of nonprofits out there that are doing great jobs. So OpenAI is one, where partnership in AI is one of them. So if you and they have different chapters in, I think, 27 different countries, where you can actually talk to people locally about the issue that you're interested in. So I think that's a really, really great start. But if we can start pulling in and kind of almost like trickle down this findings at a high level into the community organizing space, that would be the most powerful way of approaching it.
Thank you very much.
I have one question for you. You in one of your last points, you mentioned despite digitalization. I would like you to explain to the students what you mean by that, because we are in a process of decoupling in economic and technological terms. We are also seeing the birth of technological blocks, with China being a block in itself, with Russia attempting to do so. So could you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by digital balkanization, and how can we avoid it? You said this is transnational, but can we be balkanized in this field?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the digital balkanization really started occurring about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when China created the firewall for their domestic audience. So that, so for example, within China, without a VPN, you can't access things like Facebook and YouTube, etc. With the Ukraine war, there's been further balkanization in terms of the Russian. So now inside Russia, you can no longer access all the Western social media platforms as either. And then there are multiple countries whose governments, they don't even block websites, they just turn off the internet, which, is not great for the citizens. So a good example is in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. I think they had almost 9 months of complete internet blackout. Same thing in Kashmir between India and Pakistan. But it's also used quite strategically, but only for a couple of days by countries that are supposed to have fair elections, but really just, another authoritarian dictator with the military junta. So Burma is a good example where they'll shut it down for a couple of days. So that's what I meant by, the balkanization. But the problem with a lot of these balkanization efforts is that it also, it's not like you can't access other things, you can, but when you have to constantly hop from one VPN to another on a slow internet, it's just much harder for people to get access to what's, what's actually out there. So what you see right now is that typically Westerners will stay on Western social media platforms, right? I mean, I can ask you right now, how many of you guys are on VK? How many of you guys are on Apparat? How many of you are on Line or WeChat? And you're like, I probably haven't heard of most of those, but WeChat actually has a lot more members on there than, WhatsApp, because that's what's being used in China. Or how many of you guys are on Weibo, right? Like, and similarly, a lot of people in those countries have heard of those big social media platforms, but they're not really on there as much. And so what you're missing is this almost like town square. Like, how are we ever going to learn about Russian culture and what the Russian people care about? And, like, think about stupid things like, I don't know, cat videos. Like maybe the kind of cat memes that they like are a little bit different than what we like, but we would just never know that. And so that dialogue is what I'm really concerned about, despite the fact that it's almost the same technology that you have on VK versus Facebook.
Manuel, do you want to pose a question? I have a long list.
I have a lot of questions, but I prefer that the students take part in the conversation because they are the protagonists of this event. En español, si sirve, por favor. La verdad que me gustaría escucharos, ya que tenemos un buen grupo de estudiantes, a ver quién es el primero en animarse.
Great, we have one here. Antonio, do you want to open the screen and make the question live, or do you prefer me to read it? Okay, I don't see your answer, but let me read it so Evanna can start answering it. He says, is there an effective way for autonomous weapons to identify combatants and non-combatants?
So there are, and what essentially happens is you take a bunch of satellite images, right? And then, you can take a bunch of sat images, and then you teach algorithms to essentially hone in on people and what they're wearing, their height, etc., to basically identify combatants from the non-combatants. So it's very safe to say. So height is used pretty commonly because typically your combatants are not going to be a child who's under 1 meter or 130 centimeters. So that's like one way of doing it. And then there are other markers that they're currently using, but it's not it's not 100% accurate right now, which is the reason why autonomous weapons have not been deployed. So what you currently have is, what we consider human in the loop. So the algorithm will suggest, and they will put boxes around what they consider as combatants. But then you actually need a human to actually say, okay, these are the combatants. But you can imagine that as satellite imagery gets clearer and clearer, because right now it's still a little bit shaky and it's not super accurate. It's just very blurry unless you're using the super high-tech ones. But you can imagine that, in the future, you get a very crisp image, and then you're able to run facial recognition and use that as a way to identify who the combatants are.
You just mentioned satellite images. Why don't you share with us the importance of a Starlink, Elon Musk satellite network in the current Ukrainian war? It's been fundamental for Ukrainian soldiers to communicate. Could you tell us something more about it?
Are you talking about Starlink?
Yeah, Starlink, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so Starlink is a company, is Elon Musk's company that sends up. So the reason why he created Starlink is because he needed the satellite images for SpaceX. So, and then he kind of spun off as he realized that it could also sell just the raw data itself. So in the beginning of the Ukraine war, Starlink approached the Ukrainian government and said, you know, we believe in your cause. You can use our product and data for free. So they were sending, I mean, like million, like what's worth, you know, like the value of that is hundreds of millions of dollars for free, because nobody expected the Ukraine war to last as long as he did. And then by month 7, they're like, hey, look, guys, like you're taking up a huge amount of our bandwidth, like data access and servers and all of these things. And we have to pay the bills. And so it basically started saying, we're still a company at the end of the day, and you need to pay for at least a portion of it or subsidize it. So I think right now the US government is the one who has subsidized a huge chunk of the cost.
Manuel, any question?
Yeah, about the Starlink
yes.
debate, it's interesting because, of course, I agree that it's a company, they need the money, is the objective, but at the same time, from the public relation point of view, it's like a trap, because if you offer for free the service, you obtain a great reputation. But if you interrupt the service, your image can be destroyed. No, they are like a kind of trap that they cannot escape. No, I don't know how they can resolve the problem.
Evanna, do you want to react to that, or do you want me to make another question?
I 100% agree with that comment. Yeah.
So let me move to pure disinformation. Last week, 10 days ago, the European External Action Service launched a report that they have been working on for the last 5 years through their group of working on disinformation. And they have documented more than 15,000 attacks since the invasion, the annexation of Crimea by Russian forces. That was, we all know, in 2014. Since then, they have documented, as I said, more than 15,000 attacks on European Union media, networks, and so on. What is the best way to counter that? You know, because it's machines, because most of these attacks come from bots and chat, basically. Any idea of how can this be counter? How can we respond to all of that?
Yeah, there are a couple of answers to that. The first is social media. Companies would have to just step up, you know, their part in detecting and in countering. And a lot of times the teams for doing so they're quite small as compared, and so they're just stretched really thin. In the case of Twitter, after Elon Musk took it over, he fired the entire team that focused on influence operations. So there's literally no one at Twitter working on it. The second is, as you know, citizens and as a regular person, the triple verification is something that we're pushing very strongly, especially along with critical thinking. So when you read something and it sounds a little bit suspicious, like you might want to double check, right? Or triple check. We add in triple check because it's also important to know where that information is coming from. So if you know that is coming from a less than reputable site, or if you notice a typo in the website that it's on, or the fact that you live in Idaho and you know that the Idaho Times actually doesn't exist as a newspaper, but Idaho Times, you're on the idahotimes.com website, you might be like, that might be a suspicious publication. And in fact, I think it was actually done by the Kremlin. But so you actually have to just think a lot more about what you're reading and then doing that extra process. And so but I think unfortunately in most school systems around the world, the focus is much more on rote memorization rather than critical thinking. So Finland is a very good example of incorporating critical thinking. And so, they get attacked constantly by Russia ever since the 70s. And they have the lowest rate of like people actually falling for disinformation. And then the other thing I do have to add on is influence operations, it goes both ways. We detected 15,000 from the Ukraine, from Russia, but at the same time, I can guarantee you that there are tons and tons of influence operations that are targeting the Russian people as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the students here. Let me make the first one. You talked about needing to speak in policy sessions and it being something that must be understood by create these new policies. Do you believe are slowly more keener on doing so, or are they still reluctant to include technology in their contents? You partly touched upon that before, but if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Sorry, you were kind of choppy for me. Do you mind repeating the question?
Well, basically, it is why are governments reluctant to talk about technology? How is it so hard for them to discuss?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. Did you hear the question?
I did. I think you're asking why are governments reluctant to talk about technology, right? Okay. So a part of the reason why governments are reluctant to talk about technology is because they just don't know technology. If you look at your average policymaker in Europe and in the US, they're, 60 years old, right? They're not your most tech savvy folks. Second question is, or the second part to that is the internet has been a huge driver. I'm not sure what percent, so don't quote me on this, but it definitely has been one of the biggest drivers of economic development in the past 30 years. E-commerce, if you look at the most valuable companies on the NASDAQ or the S&P, it's going to be technology companies, and even companies like Tesla will bill itself as a technology company. And so they don't want to accidentally impede on that by having too many regulations. And then the third, I think, is because they're also grappling. This is something completely new. When GDPR was in discussion, there was a big conversation around like who gets actually to own your digital identity, right? Do you own your digital identity? And 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you would never had that conversation. Like, what is a digital identity? And when do we actually just put our entire lives online? I still remember when I first joined Facebook, I think I was in middle school, and I joined Facebook, and my dad was like, oh, you can't actually put your real name out there. You can't put your date of birth, because that was the sort of the norm at the time, which is that you were only online through an alias, and to put photos of yourself up there with your friends was like unthinkable for a lot of people. And I think some people are still stuck in that mindset, but there's also the notion of like, this is new, and the government is always, as I said before, it's meant to be the lagging indicator, right? And so now it's starting to catch up to, okay, we actually might have to regulate because now we're actually seeing the harmful effects. But it's not really in the business of prevention.
Thank you. We have another question here. Do you think that a DOS attack in a country could involve a major threat right now to that nation? And how can they recover from that kind of attack?
I'm assuming so DOS as in denial of service, right?
Right.
Okay. So it is definitely still, so DOS attacks are still used pretty prevalently. India, the Indian attacks from India, whether or not that is by the Indian government, I'm not going to get into that, but they've definitely done tons of DOS attacks against Pakistan. The latest one was actually just 2 weeks ago, actually, where they used a DOS attack against the Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and was actually done by a Indian ATP, which is basically backed by the Indian government. So that's still used a lot, but now is increasingly used also for like criminal cyber attacks. So these are your ransomware. They're not really geopolitical in nature. They're just done to get money from people. And so they're also starting to use DOS attacks in addition to some other tactics. But DOS is easy to use. You can find how to conduct a DOS attack for very cheap on the dark web, where you can go and hire someone to do it for like $100.
That is cheap, certainly.
Yeah.
Also, linked to this, I want you to have a conversation with Manuel on this topic. He has written on esglobal about why we haven't seen the kind of cyber attacks or the kind of cyber impact of Russia towards Ukraine in this war. You know, one could have expected to be much more disruptive, to really collapse everything due to cyber attacks. And we are not, apparently, as far as we know, we are not seeing that. Why do you think that is happening? Why are not we seeing the kind of cyber war we could have expected? And I'll give you the floor, and then I'll ask Manuel to also react to that.
Okay. I actually disagree with that premise. Russia, especially in the early days, launched hundreds of cyber attacks against Ukraine. There were a couple of very prominent ones. I would probably say that there were probably 20 to 30 pretty prominent attacks. But Ukraine has been preparing for a cyber war with Russia for a very long time, ever since Euromaidan. And Victor Zora, who's sort of like their chief digital officer for the Ukrainian government, has been very carefully ever since 2014 on building up his army of cyber defenders. And so the first thing, the minute they heard that their country was being invaded, they shored up all of their cybersecurity. This is not to say that they did not have help from from NATO countries. They certainly did. But they sort of knew that was going to happen. So there were actually quite a few attacks that made it into newspapers of Russians trying to hack into their power grid and things like that. And they were mainly stopped. I think there was one, or maybe there were two, where they actually shut down the power grid for 18 to 24 hours. It definitely had an impact, but it didn't go on for as long as the previous one was back in, I think, 2015, not Petya.
Manuel.
Yeah, I agree with Evanna that the main difference in this occasion is the support of United States, NATO, United Kingdom, to make a cyber defense of the Ukraine. Of course, in the first hour of the military intervention, there are a lot of cyber attacks, especially against the communication infrastructure. But for me, the surprise is after 1 year, the magnitude of this cyber attack is not changed. Before the welfare, every people think that Russia have the capability and the intention to use a very destructive cyber attacks, again, of kind of objectives in Ukraine. This hypothesis don't happen. No? For me, the big question in the present. No, probably there is a problem of overestimate the capabilities of Russia in this field. No. Probably the reality is that in the cyber conflict, Russia is not so impressive. No? Probably is the perception of the past. And after the UEFA, we have to change our evaluation of these capabilities.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think it probably seemed like in the past that Russia had more capabilities because the attacks were pretty widespread in terms of which countries that they impacted, and they were very targeted. Whereas with the Ukraine war, it just seemed like they were just trying to do a huge number of them. So when you're looking at quantity over quality, you just start to realize that, oh, okay, maybe they don't actually have that many people doing cyber warfare.
Thank you both. This is the last call for questions. If any of the students there wants to participate, this is your last opportunity. And if not, we will be getting close to the end of this session. Evanna, it has been extremely interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your knowledge, and your insights with all of us. And I'm still waiting. If someone wants to ask something, I don't see any more. Let me again remind all the students that you are more than invited to participate in the competition, that we are looking forward to reading and hearing and watching your proposals, and see you in Brussels maybe. Thank you very much, Evanna. Thank you again, the Embassy of
Thank you
in Spain. Thank you, Manuel, again for your collaboration.
Thank you very much.